Is our government in the possession of a crash retrieval that was made not on planet Earth?
We have a pretty good idea where those things were taken. It's not a secret anymore that those things have been retrieved. They've been retrieved all over the world by special teams. They've been taken to the best labs.
The Ukrainian researchers said, we see these UAP under all kinds of visible conditions, a lot of the time in lots of different locations.
We also have the Webb telescope that can look at such an object from a different direction than the observatories on Earth.
The myths are consistent with oftentimes referred to as the gods.
And there's a lot more going on here, not just on this planet, but on other planets.
I think this is the arc of the Covenant.
There were actually multiple arcs.
History isn't what we've been taught, and we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Area 51 was supposed to be such a secret that the Central Intelligence Agency didn't acknowledge its existence until 2013. And the only reason for the official disclosure was that, following the passing of the Freedom of Information Act, they'd no choice. Of course, no one was actually surprised. Area 51's existence had been known about for decades. Indeed, 20 years earlier, Larry King had hosted a documentary about it on network TV. Anyway, after the request, the CIA explained that the facility was used to test airplanes like the U-2 and the A-12, and also for research on behalf of the Atomic Energy Commission. Needless to say, there was no reference to extraterrestrials or UFOs. To begin with, no one really wanted to go to Area 51. Bone dry most of the time and swept by desert winds that, like sandpaper, can scour exposed skin. Perilous when flooded by rains that make the surface like a quicksand, ankle-ricking sponge, populated with poisonous reptiles and insects, and miles from civilization. A hard sell. In 1955, at the request of the CIA, Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson, a brilliant American aeronautical and systems engineer, initiated the construction of an airbase at Groom Lake, Nevada. He realized that it might be difficult to entice scientists and personnel to such a barren location, and that's why he proposed that Area 51 should be called Paradise Ranch. But after complaints by disappointed recruits, it was renamed Area 51. He was justifiably famous for developing the Lockheed U-2 and many other supersonic aircraft, but perhaps his skills in PR were a little limited. Area 51 was officially abandoned in 1997 after the launching of the U-2 spy plane. So it came as a bit of a surprise that a highly advanced surveillance drone was shown to the public at Area 51 in 2014. In 2011, the Iranian military had captured an RQ-170 drone and had begun to reverse engineer it. The American military officials were not overly worried as they were dissatisfied with its quality and performance. Their new model, the RQ-180, was unveiled in 2014, correcting problems with the earlier model's aerodynamics. It was able to stay aloft for 24 hours with a range of over 1,200 miles and was extremely maneuverable. The RQ-170 drone, in contrast, had a maximum limit of just 6 hours and its guidance system was unreliable. Quite a result for a research facility that had allegedly been closed down 20 years earlier. Over the years, many people have tried to find out what's behind those heavily guarded fences, including the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which would never let any silly pranks harm its reputation for being respectable and sensible. But this reputation hit the dirt in 2012, or more accurately, its reporters did. A BBC camera crew attempted to break into Area 51. They were rather disappointed as, to begin with, all they found was nothing of any interest. So to pass the time and have something for the cameras to record, they performed silly alien-style dances. Within minutes, they found themselves held at gunpoint and for 3 hours forced to lie face down in the dirt. After background checks were completed, they were allowed to go. Bearing in mind the warnings that are on the signs around the base, threatening arrest, fines and imprisonment, they certainly got lucky. Unfortunately, not everyone appears to get lucky when they fall foul of Area 51. We've all heard the biblical story about plucky David and his battle with Goliath. Unfortunately, in reality, it's usually Goliath who wins. In 1880, the Shahan family acquired mining rights for a location near Area 51's testing runway. But they claim in the 1950s they started being harassed. They said that aeroplanes strafed their property, and on several occasions they were held at gunpoint in their own home. They also said that the mine was rendered useless, having been polluted with radiation through nuclear testing at Area 51, and in 1954 they claimed that their mine had been firebombed by the Air Force. To avoid a court appearance, the government offered them $5.2 million for their land, but they refused, and a few months later, after the offer had expired, the 400 acres of land was allegedly seized. So, apart from the authorities and army personnel, has anyone seen what's in Area 51? Well, yes, we all can. In 2016, Google Earth published satellite images of Area 51, including a landing strip nearby. The runway is about a mile long, and there's a number of hangars clustered at one end. It is known that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense both use the site, and although there's no official explanation as to its use, security experts have suggested that it's a drone testing site. But is that the whole story? There is one most unusual activity going on there that many visitors outside the fence have noticed. Imagine, if you would, 30 Air Force personnel, shoulder to shoulder, marching down a runway, hoovering it. It's like a bizarre scene from The Simpsons or from the British absurdist comedy Monty Python's Flying Circus, and yet apparently this happens nearly every day at Area 51. The Nevada desert is great for keeping the operations cheap and isolated. The weather is perfect for flights, and the flat lake bed is ideal for building runways, but it's so dusty that aeroplane engines easily get jammed. And for that reason, the base crew has to regularly sweep and vacuum the runways. None of them has ever said whether they enjoy the task, but they probably think it sucks. Many extraordinary claims have been made about Area 51, and as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And some evidence is definitely more than extraordinary. When an aeronautical engineer with 40 years' experience at Lockheed Martin, who has 25 patents about laser-guided smart bomb systems, claims to have been involved with aliens, perhaps we should take him seriously. Boyd Bushman claimed that he'd helped extraterrestrial beings to implement anti-gravity technology at Area 51. He further stated that there were two types of alien, Wrangler and Rustler aliens, who could travel between Earth and their own planet in only 45 minutes. As part of his proof, Boyd Bushman published a photograph of one of the aliens. Unfortunately, it was actually identified as a plastic alien doll that could be bought at Walmart. Silly man, though in fairness, no harm done. However, some extraordinary claims have really muddied the waters. The most popular ones were promoted in Annie Jacobson's book, Area 51, An Uncensored History. During her research, she'd interviewed a number of retired personnel who had worked at the base. She claimed that they had told her about secret work on reverse engineering alien technology, and that the base had numerous flying saucers hidden in underground tunnels. Unfortunately, many of the interviewees subsequently said that she'd misrepresented them and their views. Reverse engineering of technology was going on, but it was the reverse engineering of Soviet technology following the capture of MiG jet fighters during the Cold War of the 1970s and 80s. They accepted that there were secret underground tunnels, but that they were associated with the Project Nerva nuclear research program conducted near Area 51 at a location called Jackass Flats. And the flying saucers? The indignant interviewees said that there was a vehicle dubbed the Ox Cart, which was a circular, fuel-carrying pod that admittedly did resemble a stereotypical flying saucer. hundreds, possibly thousands of people have visited the site. Indeed, in 2019, a Facebook page was set up that invited us all to storm Area 51 on the 20th of September. Although they hope that by Naruto running they can move faster than the bullets, it's more likely they'll be having some coffee and cake on nearby Nevada State Route 375, otherwise known as the Extra-Terrestrial Highway, because it passes by Area 51. There are quirky rest stops all along the 98-mile stretch of road. At the intersection of the Extra-Terrestrial Highway and US 93 is the E.T. Fresh Jerky restaurant. Inside, there's a mural that depicts an alien-style Wild West scene complete with alien cowboys. Further down the road, there's an Alien Research Center gift shop with its enormous alien statue standing guard. And at the town called Rachel, with its 40 inhabitants, there's a quirky and eccentric cafe called the Little A Leon, full of kitsch and memorabilia, and locals eager to share their stories of alien experiences. And maybe that's what Area 51 is all about. In an increasingly crazy world, a harmless bit of fun. Or is it? Pine Gap is the commonly used name for a satellite tracking station approximately 18 kilometers, 11 miles, southwest of the town of Alice Springs, Northern Territory, Australia, which is operated by both Australian and the United States. Since 1988, it has been officially called the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. Previously, it was known as Joint Defence Space Research Facility. Throughout the history of ufology, there are certain cases which have become so intertwined with the subject that the mention of them is used as shorthand to illustrate the nature of new forthcoming cases. The Roswell incident of 1947 has become a common reference point for researchers wishing to draw attention to new cases sharing similar characteristics. We've seen Brazilian Roswells, Russian Roswells, and Chinese Roswells. Even Britain's most famous and documented UFO case at Rendlesham Forest was for a time dubbed the British Roswell. So too, Nevada's Area 51 has become a byword for certain areas of the world where the military keep themselves hidden in the wilderness. Public scrutiny is lacking, discouraged, or even denied, and from time to time, stories of exotic technologies, sightings of strange and mysterious craft, and rumors of alien intelligence come to the fore. Sites such as Menwith Hill in Yorkshire was dubbed Britain's Area 51. Suffield Base was Canada's Area 51, and lying some 93 miles south of Alice Springs, in the heart of the Australian desert, lies Pine Gap, a joint US-Australia military base which has been pinned with the dubious label of Australia's Area 51. Certainly in the recent popular news, Pine Gap has not maintained the low profile that Area 51 has. Despite the avalanche of suspicion that cascaded upon the Nevada base in the wake of the Robert Lazar revelations of extraterrestrial craft being test-flown and back-engineered in the late 1980s, and court cases from ex-employees suffering unusual health problems that made the news. Since the launch of the stealth aircraft, Area 51 has not been at the fulcrum of global events in the way that Pine Gap has. Their exoteric purposes are similar but not identical, with Pine Gap a communications hub rather than a test ground for new aircraft technologies. Yet Pine Gap's remote desert location and interconnectedness with the darker areas of US military policy has inevitably led to similar rumors about what goes on behind closed doors, such as secretly testing new technologies, deep underground bases, UFO activity, and an extraterrestrial presence. After Pine Gap's opening in 1964, it didn't take long for rumors to surface of strange goings-on at the base. Noted Australian UFO researcher Bill Chalker has looked in depth at many facets of the Pine Gap mystery and cited an article from Australia's Nation Review in May 1974, which suggested that Pine Gap was the site of research into electromagnetic propulsion. Lecturer Steve Deo, who claimed to have worked on exotic technologies in Australia, also quoted the Nation Review article in his 1978 book, The Cosmic Conspiracy. This new technology was to be based at Pine Gap, and Richard Nixon intended to use the technology to propose a solution to the energy crisis. According to Deo, Pine Gap had all of the inherent high voltage, low-frequency power broadcast stations to literally send electronic magnetic power around the world, providing electricity free of fossil fuel creation to any machine, cars, submarines and so on, tuned into its frequency. Dayu also investigated the idea that Pine Gap might be a Noah's Ark in the event of war on US assets, and that nearby to the visible Pine Gap lies an underground facility capable of withstanding heavy attack and sheltering key US personnel. Dayu also documents reports from witnesses who say they saw white discs about 30 feet in diameter with US Air Force markings that have been ferried into Australia inside large military air transports. This suggests what many critics of an ET solution to the UFO mystery purport, namely that UFOs are the latest flight technologies being tested covertly. This argument has long been made in relation to Area 51, with numerous video and personal testimony of peculiar lights in the sky around the facility being evident of a new military, not ET technology. But it has to be said that such a technology, though long muted, has yet to be revealed. Interestingly, in later interviews, Dayu cites a number of physicists involved in different countries around the world as part of electromagnetic propulsion research. The name he puts forward in the US is Dr. Edward Teller, who is the man Robert Lazar would claim recruited him to work on the ET anti-gravity propulsion systems at Area 51. Alfred Lebremont-Weber, in a detailed article for Examiner.com, put together a detailed report on alleged UFO ET activity at Pine Gap. A number of UFO sighting reports came in the form of a leaked report sent to Rumour Mill News anonymously in 1996 that detail a number of UFO sightings from the history of Pine Gap. One case that did receive publicity and was also referenced by researcher Bill Chalker in his summary was an incident involving 3 kangaroo hunters in 1989. Around 4:30 a.m., they witnessed a large camouflage door open in the side of a low hill, out of which a metallic disc slowly emerged and then flew off at tremendous speed. The camouflage door closed and nothing further could be seen. Other sightings quoted by Weber include a sighting from 1975 from a passenger plane that observed a light white object 18 miles from the base before it too disappeared into the distance at great speed. The report also alleges that in 1980, 2 Northern Territory policemen in the midst of a missing persons search witnessed another incident in the area of a camouflage door as 3 bathtub-shaped objects flew over the base and then disappeared into a hillside. The mystery deepens further in a story told by Bill Chalker about a man who claims not only to have had alien contact and abduction, but also to have been taken aboard a UFO and flown into a base beneath Pine Gap, where evidence of alien liaison between aliens and the military and government was occurring on a cosmic scale. Using the pseudonym Greg, the man claims to have had encounters with imaginary friends during his youth, which throughout his adolescence soon began to morph into encounters with strange beings aboard alleged ET craft. Later in his life, he claimed that these craft began to take him to secret bases and claimed that underneath Pine Gap lay a joint human extraterrestrial facility and was witness to people being subjected to cruel abduction procedures and began to fear for his own safety. Not long after Greg had relayed his story to Bill Chalker, Chalker lost contact with the man and could later find no trace of his presence. Greg was not the only one to allege that ETs were involved with the underground facility at Pine Gap. Weber's report transcribes a roundtable discussion involving whistleblowers, Command Sergeant Major Robert Dean, who has been on record for many years regarding ET presence on Earth following his posting at Shape HQ, and Arthur Newman, who for some time was going under the pseudonym of Henry Deacon, who sensationally claims there are teleportation stations underneath underground bases, one of which he used to transport to Mars in clandestine operations for the US government. Newman claimed that there are teleport bases underneath both Area 51 and Pine Gap, and travel between the 2 sites is common for those active in secret operations. Robert Dean would go further in elaborating the claims of extraterrestrial activity at the Pine Gap underground base. One of the largest National Security Agency facilities in the world is at Pine Gap. But what most people have no understanding of it is that underground at Pine Gap is one of the largest extraterrestrial facilities on the planet. Our remote viewers have been looking in on that place for years and years and years. That facility in Australia at Pine Gap apparently is an extraterrestrial R&R centre. And people say, what do you mean R&R? It's a military term meaning rest and relaxation. One thing that becomes apparent when looking at the reports of UFOs and exotic technologies in relation to Pine Gap and Area 51 is the authority of the witnesses who put forward testimony. For Area 51, we have multiple witnesses who put their names forward, have given interviews and put their testimony on the record. These witnesses may be controversial and some of their histories and motives are being questioned. But the likes of Robert Lazar, the scientist who famously claimed to have been recruited to back-engineer ET spacecraft and was amongst the first to reveal what was behind the Area 51 curtain, Bill Uhouse, who claimed to have worked directly with an ET at Area 51 to assist in figuring the working of ET spacecraft, and Dan Baruch, who claimed to have been intimately involved with the ET-human relationship at Area 51 and that the ETs were actually time travelers from different timelines. All at least are on record with their claims and backgrounds open to scrutiny. The one Pine Gap whistleblower who has gone on the record is ex-employee David Rosenberg, whose 2011 book Inside Pine Gap, The Spy Who Came In From the Desert, is a personal account of a US citizen who spent many years working at Pine Gap and was unforthcoming in revealing any further mysteries surrounding exotic technology and UFOs' ET bases. He states, despite the countless stories involving UFOs and Pine Gap offered up by the internet, the aliens must have kept a very low profile during my 18-year tenure in operations, as I never saw any evidence of aliens at or around Pine Gap. Bill Chalker reviewed the book and interviewed Rosenberg in the hopes of gleaning any further information regarding some of the UFO stories, and concluded the conspiracy-driven will probably not accept that David Rosenberg is giving an honest and personal accounting of his time at Pine Gap. I found him to be very forthcoming within the limits of his security restrictions. However, it's worth noticing that in an interview with reddins.com.au, Rosenberg stated that I was under a lifetime agreement with the agency, NSA, to have all written material screened prior to publication. This essentially means that the book has been given the green light by the security services, so any potential controversial content would likely never have made it to print. Perhaps Pine Gap's most glaring contrast to Area 51 is where it sits in a geopolitical context. Apart from the revelations regarding ET craft, Area 51 has not been newsworthy since the launch of the stealth program in the late 1980s. Pine Gap has been in the news over the last few years with revelations over its links to the surveillance of the public. It's arguably of great strategic importance to the global balance of power and US foreign policy. It's certainly of significant importance to Australian foreign policy and its unwavering support for US interests.
It's a huge factor for your own perception of reality, meeting a different being.
The whole planet deserves to know the truth. You may be one of the few people who might be able to help us understand.
Species are brought together on a table and have diplomatic conversations
This is happening?
This is happening.
Where? Give an example. What happened with you?
This gray being enters the room. It's a strong, crisp frequency that your body reacts to.
It's happening. It's happening behind the scenes. I mean, Tim, what is the true history of Earth?
Much has been said and written about the possible influence of extraterrestrials on the origins of the human race, but none more so than the enigmatic and perhaps sinister Council of Nine. Those who have helped promote the Council of Nine and spread its teachings are numerous, but among the best known are Dr. Andrija Purik, Dr. D.G. Vinod, Yuri Geller, Phyllis Schlemmer, Gene Roddenberry, and Dr. H.R. Hurtak. Purik was the instigator of the project and in the early 1950s had worked on a number of classified projects for US Army intelligence. He also invented a number of medical and other devices which may have been a byproduct of his time in the US Army. One of his inventions was a gadget which allowed motor vehicles to run using electrolysis to split water into hydrogen and oxygen rather than petrol. This actually worked. So not surprisingly, the major oil companies ensured that it never came to fruition. Purik's relevance to what occurred with the Nine ties in with his claims to have been part of a 1948 investigation into the military application of psychic abilities with the US Navy's Project Penguin, which was a precursor of the much better-known StarGate project. The US Navy was interested in seeing if psychic abilities, in other words telepathy, could be used to allow real-time communication between submarines while submerged, something which at the time was extremely difficult. It was during this period, which also involved evaluating the effects of electromagnetic waves on human beings, that he came convinced that there was an intelligence of some kind in the universe operating via various electromagnetic frequencies and that human beings could make mental contact with it. It's hardly surprising that this project and what it concerned, plus the esoteric interests of many of those who were directly involved, attracted the attention of US intelligence agencies, including the CIA, who were curious to see if this really was contact with an extraterrestrial race, and if so, could it be turned to their advantage? In fact, the role of the CIA in this matter cannot be understated, because a few years later they were involved in setting up and funding the StarGate remote viewing project. So it was obvious that they would also take an interest in what people like Andrea Purik, Yuri Geller and James Hurtak were doing. As far as Yuri Geller is concerned, in 1973 he was taken to the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, for evaluation by the CIA, and given the way in which the tests were monitored and controlled, the CIA was convinced he was genuine. Although when it first emerged it seemed to be little more than New Age cult interest in the Nine, it proved to be long-lasting, and it still has many thousands of members worldwide, including scientists, politicians, and multimillionaire businessmen who contribute to any costs involved. In one instance, this included a member of the Canadian Bronfam family, whose immense wealth is tied to the Seagram Drinks Company that produces a huge variety of alcoholic beverages. The group of alleged extraterrestrials that attracted all this attention, also known as simply the Nine, claim that they have their origins in ancient Egypt, where they were known as the Ennead, who comprised Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, who were all Egyptian gods. The connection to ancient Egypt is extremely important in the affairs of the Nine, and we'll see that this connection is woven into the very fabric of what occurred. The messages from the Nine are normally received through various mediums, who channel the information in a trance state. They claim that they are highly evolved intelligences and are in effect God or gods, and they act as the Nine Principles of God. One of the very first people to recognize the existence of the Nine was Professor Andrea Puharak when, in December 1952, he brought an Indian mystic named Dr. D.G. Vinod into his laboratory in Glen Clove, Maine. The laboratory served as a research center for Puharik's Roundtable Foundation, which he created in 1948 to research the many anomalies found in paranormal phenomena, and he managed to attract the services of several well-known contemporary psychics, such as the medium Eileen Garrett and the Dutch clairvoyant Peter Herkos. Shortly after arriving at the laboratory, Dr. Vinod began to channel what he referred to as the Nine, or the Nine Principles, and his utterances were eagerly recorded by Dr. Puharich. In the months prior to Vinod's return to India, a specially constituted group formed by Puharich met on a regular basis to hear the Indian mystic channel the Nine's comments. It was during this period of time that the Nine proclaimed themselves to be God, stating that God is nobody else than we together, the Nine Principles of God. Unsurprisingly, the pronouncements of the Nine also attracted the attention of not only the burgeoning number of those with an interest in UFOs, who were anxious to hear what the Nine had to say, but also an equal number of individuals who took an interest in some sort of esoteric aspects of Egyptology. The Council of Nine also claimed to be a group of highly evolved beings that have direct control of the Earth and the human race. They also claim to have created the human race for their own purposes. Yet this seems to be at odds with other versions of who or what the Council of Nine really are, because when Puhrich involved the renowned Israeli illusionist Yuri Gagarin in his project, a different picture emerged. Puhrich hypnotized Geller and asked him to get in contact with the Nine. He successfully did, and reported that the Nine were in fact highly advanced artificial intelligences housed aboard a Sentinel spacecraft called Spectra. From this revelation, Dr. Puhrich got the impression that Geller was intended to serve as an interface or intermediary between an extraterrestrial and perhaps divine intelligence and the human race, and that rather than being a spaceship, Spectra acted as an emissary of the Nine. Somewhat taken aback, Puhrich asked specifically if they were the same Nine principals contacted by Dr. Vinod, and they said that they were. He also asked if they were responsible for Kenneth Arnold's iconic sighting in 1947 of 9 unidentified flying objects near Mount Rainier. Again, they said that they were. Again, the number 9 appears to be significant, so they may well have been behind this sighting. Sensing that there was something extremely profound occurring here, Puhrich traveled to Israel and continued to work with Yuri Geller over a period of several months, and during this time he witnessed the spontaneous occurrence of many paranormal events. These included the disappearance and reappearance of various objects and other assorted poltergeist-type effects. It was now an accepted part of the procedure that Geller was hypnotized prior to each session taking place, and that he channeled messages which were recorded on tape. It was found that sometimes the messages appeared on the recorder without it being turned on, and other occasions the recordings were spontaneously erased. Another factor that became evident through these messages was that there are many races in existence throughout the galaxy, and they are all in loose alliances, but all of them are aware of the Nine and the Nine of them, because, although powerful, the Nine are essentially non-physical and need the other races to interact directly with the physical universe. In times long gone, this might have been called possession, because that was what in effect occurred. Yet another startling aspect of this fact is that despite the sheer size and diversity of the galaxy, in many ways the Earth is utterly unique, because we have free will while other races do not. For this reason, they frequently visit the Earth and manifest here so they can enjoy what is unobtainable anywhere else. This is the reason that another individual brought in by Puhrich, this time the American medium Phyllis Schlemmer, who, based on her contact with the Nine, wrote the best-selling book entitled The Only Planet of Choice. In this case, the title of the book refers precisely to the way in which here on Earth we and the ET visitors have free will and can make choices. Another member of the group assembled by Andrea Puhrich was Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the highly influential and long-running TV series and film franchise Star Trek. And it's no accident that he later went on to produce the Star Trek spin-off Deep Space Nine. Perhaps the use of the word nine in the title is another indication of Roddenberry's interest in them. Another fascinating aspect of the channeled messages was the news that way back in prehistory, there was an existing population on the Earth, the people of Africa, and they were intended to act as a control group against which to measure how well those created by the Nine placed here fared. However, the experiment did not go as planned because there was interference with the gene pool from which the new race were created. This interference came from beings who originated in the Pleiades. They were called the Others and seemed to equate with the followers of Satan or the Beast. It has also been suggested by the Nine that the Earth was, and still is, a battleground between the beings from the Pleiades and the Nine, or, since they're non-physical, with whatever entities they chose to inhabit at the time. They also implied that the UFOs we see in the skies above us are part of this battle. Another important character involved in this interaction with the Nine was Dr. H.R. Hurtak, who was a social scientist, linguist, futurist, and the author of another extremely influential book, The Keys of Enoch. Hurtak's book is particularly relevant to the Nine and their teachings because the text, much of which was channeled directly from the Nine, deals with higher states of consciousness and explains how the human race is directly connected to a higher evolutionary structure of universal intelligence, and this is exactly what the Nine claim to be. According to Hurtak, the Great Pyramid was built by the Nine to act as a physical stargate, and the design of the pyramids at Giza and also the pyramids on Mars is deliberate, because the design allows them to tap into and use the cosmic energies that ebb and flow around us. This energy, in addition to its use as a power source, seems to be intimately connected to the Akashic records. In other words, the pyramids were also designed to accumulate and store information for the benefit of the Nine. The information that came from the Nine was frequently apocalyptic, and this may not be an accident either, because as with other similar encounters, there may be much more to the Nine than first meets the eye. This may come from the attentions of the CIA, who were noted for their keen interest in anything that might gain them an advantage in the related fields of subversion and intelligence gathering. However, despite all the arguments about their existence or non-existence, the Nine continue to have many followers from around the world, and their messages continue to offer solace of sorts to those who believe in them. If this is the case, and they offer no obvious harm, and perhaps their messages can bring peace to a troubled world. Perhaps the ongoing struggles they claim to have with the Pleiadians have ensured this lasting peace, and long may it continue. Project Serpo is an alleged top-secret exchange program between the United States government and an alien planet called Serpo. According to various whistleblowers, 12 American military personnel visited the planet between 1965 and 1978. A few years ago, a series of emails were sent to a well-known UFO discussion group claiming that the project was indeed real and that there was evidence to prove it. Fascinating information has also surfaced that there were close connections between Project Serpo and the Roswell incident. Project Serpo. Stories about Project Serpo, allegedly a top-secret exchange program between the United States government and an alien planet called Serpo in the Zeta Reticuli star system, have been circulating for a couple of decades. One of the first mentions of this project came in 1983 when a man identifying himself as United States Air Force Sergeant Richard C. Doty contacted investigative journalist and paranormal researcher Linda Moulton Howe, claiming to have access to Air Force records of the alien exchange program for her HBO documentary, The E.T. Factor. Just over 2 decades later, in 2005, a series of emails were sent to a UFO discussion group run by Victor Martinez, claiming that Project Serpo was real and that there was evidence to prove it. Sergeant Richard C. Doty is certainly an enigmatic character. Doty began his U.S. Air Force career in 1968, first training for the Air Force Security Police and later moving on to other security-related positions. He joined the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI, in 1979 and retired in 1988. Many UFO researchers believe Doty is the source, or one of the sources, of the infamous MJ-12 material, classified government documents which, among other things, describe the crash of a disc-shaped aircraft near Roswell, New Mexico in July 1947. What he said he had to give to Linda Moulton Howe were documents that proved that 12 American military personnel paid a secret visit to an alien planet in the Zeta Reticuli system as part of Project Serpo. Doty said he would supply her with the relevant Air Force records of the exchange for her HBO documentary, The E.T. Factor. But that was the last she ever heard from him, and he never provided any evidence to substantiate his story. There may have been a very good reason for that. In the 1980s, Richard Doty was a special agent for the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A few years ago, Doty went public, claiming that while working at Kirtland, it was his job to fake documents and generate false information and pass them on to UFO researchers. In return, Doty and his colleagues were made aware of what was happening in the UFO community, thus alerting the military when anyone was getting too close to discovering their top-secret technology. The Air Force did not comment on whether they were aware of Doty's activities or if there's any truth to his claim of working in this capacity for them. In 2005, when a series of emails were sent to a UFO discussion group run by Victor Martinez, claiming that Project Serpo, which began in 1965 and ended in 1978, was very real. The emails were sent by someone calling themselves Request Anonymous, who claimed to be a retired employee of the US government who had been involved in a special program. The initial emails dealt with the Roswell incident and differs remarkably from the official account. It says, "As for Roswell, it occurred, but not like the storybooks tell. There were 2 crash sites, one southwest of Corona, New Mexico, and the second at Pelona Peak, south of Datil, New Mexico. The crash involved 2 extraterrestrial craft. The Corona site was found a day later by an archaeology team. This team reported the crash site to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department. A deputy arrived the next day and summoned a state police officer. One live entity, EBE, was found hiding behind a rock. The entity was given water but declined food. The entity was then later transferred to Los Alamos. The information eventually went to Roswell Army Airfield. The site was examined and all evidence was removed. The bodies were taken to Los Alamos National Laboratory because they had a freezing system that allowed the bodies to remain frozen for research. The craft was taken to Roswell and then on to Wright Field, Ohio. The anonymous emailer went on to say that the second site in Catron County, New Mexico, was not discovered until August 1949 by 2 ranchers. A USAF recovery team took custody of all the evidence from the site, including 6 bodies which were taken to Sandia AF Base, but later transferred to Los Alamos. The live entity, which was also recovered from the first crash, communicated with military officials and gave them the location of his home planet. The entity lived until 1952. But before he died, he had provided the military with a full explanation of the items found inside the 2 crafts. One item was a communication device with which the entity was allowed to make contact with his planet. A meeting was also arranged between the aliens and the military, and it was set for April 1964 in New Mexico. When that meeting happened, the aliens landed and retrieved the bodies of their dead comrades. Information was exchanged in English using a translation device the aliens possessed. The emailer then goes on to describe the beginnings of Project Serpo. In 1965, we had an exchange program with the aliens. We carefully selected 12 military personnel, 10 men and 2 women. They were trained, vetted, and carefully removed from the military system. The 12 were skilled in various specialities. Near the northern part of the Nevada test site, the aliens landed and the 12 Americans left. One entity was left on Earth. The original plan was for our 12 people to stay 10 years and then return to Earth. But something went wrong. The 12 remained until 1978, when they returned to the same location in Nevada. 7 men and 1 woman returned. 2 died on the aliens' home planet. 4 others decided to remain, according to the returnees. Of the 8 that returned, all have died. The last survivor died in 2002. The returnees were isolated from 1978 until 1984 at various military installations. The Air Force Office of Special Investigation was responsible for their security and safety. AFOSI also conducted debriefing sessions with the returnees. The source of these fascinating and potentially earth-shattering emails has never been discovered, though 1 or 2 UFO researchers believe that it might have been Richard Doty. If so, does that mean they should be interpreted as disinformation, or is there a core truth within the claims? The February 2006 issue of UFO magazine focused on Project Serpo and included a number of statements by some of the main figures involved in the leaking of classified information about it. Among these statements was one by Richard Doty, former special agent assigned to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, concerning what he had experienced during his military service, which may be connected to parts of the Project Serpo story. In a 2013 book published called Secret Journey to Planet Serpo, a true story of interplanetary travel by freelance writer and UFO researcher Len Kasten. According to the blurb for the book, on July 16, 1965, a massive alien spacecraft from Zeta Reticuli star system landed at the Nevada test site north of Las Vegas. Following a plan set in motion by President Kennedy in 1962, the alien visitors, known as the Ebens, welcomed 12 astronaut-trained military personnel aboard their craft for the 10-month journey to their home planet Serpo, 39 light-years away. In November 2005, former and current members of the Defense Intelligence Agency, directed by Kennedy to organize the Serpo exchange program, came forward to reveal the operation, including details from the 3,000-page debriefing of the 7 members of the Serpo team who returned after 13 years on the planet. It should be noted that Zeta Reticuli is a popular location in UFO reports as the home system of an alien race called the Greys. It's used by Betty and Barney Hill in their abduction story, and also by Bob Lazar since his account of captured alien craft. Unfortunately, there seems to be nothing new in Kasten's book, and the source of its entire content would appear to be the anonymous emails sent to Victor Martinez's UFO list.
There are 2 types of lizard or reptilian kind of beings. When they appear on Earth, they try to do it covertly. Some come from a total different reality, others come from different planets. They all have their own agenda.
When we had EBA 1 in captivity from 1947, 1952, one of the big questions was, do you have a soul? EBA 1 said, absolutely I have a soul. It is eternal.
There are phenomena going on. We also have different life forms, and the Pentagon reports acknowledge that. So when Earth enters a full harmonious level 4 consciousness, those things will appear and they will affect everyone. And we can see that there are some forces on this planet, extraterrestrial forces, that try to ascend humanity faster.
Deep in the quiet frozen tundra of the vast Siberian wasteland, hidden from the eyes of the Western world, a group of men and women busily scurry from one end of a giant laboratory to another. Some of them wear white medical smocks, while others are protected by heavier outer clothing stitched with lead fiber. All wear nameplate bars. A 3-inch square piece of gauze-like material dangling below each bar, looking much like a military campaign ribbon, is in reality a radiation detection badge. The laboratory itself is deeply hidden underground. It is heavily fortified on the outside, and within, Russian sentries, the elite of the Red Army, stand guard. In one corner of the spacious laboratory, standing below the high, curtained window, is a roped-off area. Inside this enclosure stands a silver disc the size of a small 2-story building. The disc is unlike anything seen by human eyes. With a smooth mirror finish, each part seems perfectly engineered, precisely curved and uniformly angled. The entire design of the disc blends together to form a beautiful, otherworldly form, with not a single rough edge or ungainly protrusion. The term otherworldly is not an understatement, for as fantastic as it sounds, the disc is a captured UFO, an interstellar space vehicle which crash-landed more than 6 months ago in Zhigansk, along the banks of the Lena River, located in northwestern Siberia. Inside the spotless craft are elaborate instrument panels, as yet unknown mathematical formula on their dials. Charts of the vast reaches of space adorn walls, rooms and entranceways are designed with flawless engineering principles in mind, and highly sophisticated touches intended for comfort, ease of movement and precision maintenance are in evidence. Those in attendance, physicians, space engineers, chemists, nuclear physicists and astrophysicists have been summoned secretly, drafted from highly classified dossier compiled by top-ranking officers of the Soviet Academy of Science in Moscow. They have been flown under cover of darkness to this remote spot not far from the University at Tomsk, situated in the south of this Arctic region. Their assignment, probing the craft and its secrets. The detailed information concerning this captured space vehicle has been supplied to this publication not by a writer of science fiction stories, nor by a member of the press, Soviet or otherwise. The account was supplied via a secret communications from deep behind the Iron Curtain. What is more, our source informs us that the Soviet officials have the bodies of two of the occupants of this extraterrestrial vehicle. Their demise unknown, or as yet unrevealed. The bodies have been flown by jet to Moscow University for autopsy and further study. The bodies are small, almost childlike, with elongated limbs, arms and very large heads. The skin texture of these extraterrestrial creatures is rough, almost leather-like. Their eyes are large, with what one might call popping or protruding. Their mouths are small. When found behind the controls of their ship, they were already deceased. The garments they wore, which had been removed for purposes of study and evaluation, were uniforms of some sort, identical with the exceptions of shoulder patches on an embossed triangle, and on the other a square within which was a tiny circle, obviously a signet of rank of some sort. They wore no underclothing beneath this, and their skin is hairless. Aside from that, the outer space astronauts, the males, have sexual organs equal to that of their human male counterparts. The UFO, which as far as is known by our standards is undamaged, has been in Soviet hands since February 1979. It was spotted via radar over the Ural Mountains and dropped to Earth, obviously disabled, on February the 17th. It was tracked rapidly, losing altitude over Zygansk along the banks of the Lena River. Since November of 1978, a total of 47 unidentified flying objects have been spotted and radar tracked over Siberia, a frozen area which stretches from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific and from the Arctic Ocean to Mongolia. Early on the morning of December the 21st, 1978, residents of Krasnoyarsk stood dumbfounded as a jet aircraft suddenly came into view. The rate it was traveling, even for a jet fighter, was extraordinarily rapid, especially for that altitude. Within seconds, it was joined by a second, and then a third, and finally a fourth. Without any apparent loss of speed, they flew from a side-to-side formation to a formation one behind the other, and in what seemed like a straight line, flew across the clear sky. One reliable witness reported, after pausing for a matter of brief seconds, they suddenly rose together as one and sped into the blue, behind a mass of snow-covered peaks, and disappeared. Just before they vanished, they came to a dead stop in mid-air. It could be determined that they were round, shiny and metallic, glinting brightly in the rays of the sun. Approximately 2 weeks later, high over the Transatlantic Railroad in Khabarovsky, a stretch of land situated near the reindeer-raising farms of Vladivostok, the interior of a bus suddenly became unbearably hot. Those in their seats began to sweat, and their ears were shattered by the almost deafening sound, which resembled the buzzing of millions of bees. According to one occupant of the bus, fur trapper Vladimir Petrov, the sound, filled the inside of the bus, bemusing my senses, all the while becoming hotter and hotter. Finally, the driver had to stop, and to escape the unbearable heat, all of us had to climb out. Gazing upward, we saw a large, white, or more appropriately, silver object spinning about 200 feet overhead. It weaved in a jerky motion from side to side. It banked somewhat and then went into an upward spiraling motion, did a figure eight, balanced on its rim, and then finally rolled twice, all the while climbing for altitude. It hovered for about 40 seconds before darting away and out of sight. Unlike these previous reports, UFO sightings over Russian territory had not been limited to the icy regions of Siberia. They have occurred over the years throughout the entire motherland, from Moscow to Leningrad, Rostov and Volgograd, and eastward to the Red Satellite countries. UFOs have become an almost normal occurrence. On June 16, 1978, two round objects hovered for 20 minutes high over the city of Petrozavodsk near Moscow. Although accounts varied as to their size, many witnesses agreed that purple, red and bright green exhaust emanated simultaneously from the twin craft. 4 months later, a UFO skimmed the treetops on the outskirts of the Moscow suburb, causing automobiles to come to a dead stop for 13 minutes on the road below. For that amount of time, television sets lost their power and household electricity went dead. There have been many other reported throughout the Soviet Union. During the 6-month period from October 3, 1978 to March 6, 1979, sightings have become so numerous that the Russian government ordered a UFO alert in which scientists requested that citizens not hesitate in reporting encounters directly to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. This was the first open admission that a government-sponsored UFO research program was being conducted. The Academy not only requested that all sightings be reported, but also urged that a great amount of care be exercised in securing as much pertinent data as possible concerning size, shape, color, general description, and other outstanding features of the objects. They asked for photographic documentation wherever possible. That something major is going on was revealed by well-known Soviet author and lecturer Alexander Katsentsev, who told a prominent American newspaper, "Exciting new information has been seeping through from Petrozavodsk concerning a spaceship that visited the area recently. The Petrozavodsk sightings concerns a ball of light that appeared in the sky over the city on September 24, 1977. Approximately 3 minutes after the ball of light was spotted, it turned into a silvery disc-shaped saucer that hung in the sky, zigzagged over the buildings, hung suspended again, and then maneuvered gracefully for close to half an hour before zooming off straight up and out of sight." Russian physicist Dr. Vladimir Ashasa brought out that the Petrozavodsk UFO seems to indicate that an extraterrestrial civilization is in the final stage prior to direct communication with the Earth. Other scientists agree that a first major landing, a breakthrough between people of different planetary systems, is quite possible in the near future. Many speculate that this breakthrough, when it comes, may be more than we bargained for. Many within the scientific community express alarm at the prospect that the downed alien spacecraft may bring dire repercussions from a planetary system or society of its origin. In fact, a tone of skepticism in the form of a warning has already been expressed by a group of Soviet space experts connected with the Academy. Nuclear Fission Authority Dr. Anatol Petrovich, instrumental in the October 4, 1957 launching of the 188-pound Sputnik 1 satellite, said, "If alien intelligence possess the scientific knowledge to send one or several of their vehicles into our solar system close enough for one of their number to come crashing onto our planet, they must also know the fate of its occupants and what has happened to the celestial vehicle in which they came. It's quite within the realm of possibility that our motives in taking the ship for examination might be misconstrued and our part in the incident may be deemed as a hostile act. I would not be surprised if one day they would make themselves known to us and demand, 'What have you done with our crew?'" He further stated, just as their forefathers may have come in their fiery chariots centuries ago to teach and console, as well as to instruct and cherish, their motives today may be entirely different. On the other side of the ocean, author and UFO expert Arthur Shuttlewood brought out in his book UFO Prophecy, these aerial phenomena could forecast events whose worldwide impact will be fully felt in the course of the next few years. We live in an unsafe and unpredictable period fraught with hidden dangers. Crisis point might easily be reached much sooner than most people expect. It is not feasible that members of more enlightened societies from other planets, perhaps far outside of the boundary of our own solar system, are combining on a mission to Earth during a worrying, fear-filled phase of our evolution. Their duty is to assist in the change to a new age. It is of equal probability that they are concerned for us and our planet. One can learn much from studying the culture of these aliens. UFOs are an important link between worlds of the spiritual and the material, and will prove to be a significant means of aiding man to understand the spiritual oneness of all creation. One thing is for sure, not only are they here, but likely to have been monitoring our progress for many thousands of years. What secrets are being kept? And for those at the top of such incredible knowledge, how well do they understand their technology and intentions? Tensions certainly bubbled between Russia and the US during the Cold War, and the results could have been devastating. Luckily, as we know, the tension eventually fizzled out and equilibrium was restored. However, research suggests that newspapers never managed to capture the full picture. What was going on behind closed doors? In April 1978, after their return from a 16-day trip to the Soviet Union, two National Enquirer journalists told their dramatic story of an incredible UFO attack on the northern Russian city of Petrozavodsk. During the attack, the UFO was said to have hovered, bombarding the city with ray beams which bored through holes in windows and paving blocks. Shortly afterwards, the Soviet government clamped a shroud of secrecy over the news surrounding this and similar encounters. Even so, the two journalists were able to penetrate the shroud and get inside information from their Soviet contacts, supporting the UFO attack story. While these two journalists may have gotten a story, there is evidence which suggests that the journalists did not get the truth. In fact, what they got was probably a story concocted by high-level Soviet intelligence sources. Their intent was, perhaps, to cover up a dangerous blunder caused by experiments being conducted by their own scientists. Based on this new evidence, it now appears that the UFO attack was actually a malfunction of a high-energy beam weapon, which almost brought disaster to the Russian city. The full story behind this weird weapon began in the late 1960s, when the Soviets set up a huge underground experimental facility in the southern part of the USSR. Over the next few years, the US intelligence got wind of the experiments and directed one of their spy satellites to keep an eye on the sites. By 1973, the US successfully launched the Big Bird satellites into orbit. These 12-ton units could reveal the license plates of numbers of vehicles parked at the sites, as well as the nature of the equipment being funneled into the underground laboratories. This only strengthened the Pentagon's worst fears. The radiation detected in the atmosphere above these sites clearly indicated the Soviets were deeply involved in manufacturing high-energy particle beam generators as war weapons of the future. This sent the Pentagon brass into a huddle. There were no huge appropriations in the US for such weapons development. Aside from a few pilot projects, little could be done. They could only watch and wait. But they didn't have to wait for long. Early in 1976, the Soviets completed their first successful tests of a killer satellite system. The Soviets were now well on their way towards building a weapons system designed to give them a space domination capability. Their satellites could now be equipped for seek and destroy missions against any other satellites or space stations, particularly those satellites netted into the US atomic submarine fleet. For the first time in a quarter of a century, the balance of terror had shifted into the Soviets' hands, something that didn't sit well with the US defense chiefs. Even so, the US military was not to be outdone so easily. In August 1978, news leaks out that the US had also gone into the laser weapons business. After refusing to comment for 2 years, a Pentagon official confirmed that in 1973, the US had successfully shot down a pilot's drone with a high-energy laser beam. They also confirmed that the Army and Navy tests had succeeded and that a helicopter and anti-tank missiles had been destroyed in flight by laser weapons. This put both the US and the USSR in the space weapons business. While these comments reached the public, there was far more going on the USSR than ever reached print. The Soviet experiments were speeded up after the tests were successful. Now, research was being pushed well beyond the death ray of science fiction. The Soviets were after the means to develop energy curtains, which could be thrown up along their borders, and sky shields, which would place an energy umbrella over their strategic missile sites. All of them are byproducts of high-energy particle beams. Anything attempting to enter this curtain of energy explodes instantly. Set up to cover a border of the sky above the missile sites, these beams form an invisible, impenetrable wall against atomic and hydrogen bombers or ballistic missiles. This is where the UFO attack story comes into the picture. Many now believe that something along this line occurred in the sky above Petrozavodsk on February the 20th, 1977. They suggest that the Soviets were conducting experiments with their high-energy beam when it encountered particle obstructions in the atmosphere, sending the beam haywire. Thus, the brilliant glow in the sky was not a galactic vehicle, but a glowing plasma shell, and the ray beams were laser-like splatters of the beam deflected downward, where the energy was absorbed, boring holes in glass windows and paving blocks. On the morning of April 2, 1978, the US defense satellites zoomed in on a high concentration of energy moving across the North Atlantic. As they continued to track the concentration, it zeroed in towards Newfoundland's Bell Island area, less than 15 miles from St. John's, the capital of this Canadian province. When this high concentration of energy hit the island, it collapsed into a massive thunderbolt. The flashes and blasts were recorded at several US satellite tracking stations, and the date was immediately forwarded to the Special Weapons Laboratory at Los Alamos in California. Within hours, 2 military representatives from the labs arrived at the site of the blast. Following their investigation, the 2 investigators, Freeman and Warren, filed their reports with the Pentagon. As we'd expect, the reports are still classified. However, the Defense Department did confirm that Los Alamos labs were doing work on high-energy lasers and that they were interested in the Bell Island episode. The blast occurred on a farm owned by James Bickford at Lance Cove. According to local residents, the electric power went out just before the blast, as did the phone service. One woman stated that sparks flew out of her electric oven and a man had the phone knocked from his hand. But the major damage occurred around the Bickford property. Here, what was described as an energy ball blasted down a metal chimney and a surge of energy vaporized the electric wires in the area. It blasted the metal doors from switchboxes, melted glass fuses, and exploded outlets from the walls. Behind the Bickford home, it disintegrated the wires leading to a chicken coop, where it blew the shed to pieces and killed the birds. Behind the shed, it burrowed 3 identical holes in the ground. The holes were 1.5 feet deep, 6 feet across, and arranged in a triangle 6 feet apart. Bickford told a reporter the blast was louder than 300 charges going off in the mine. Others around the area described the brilliant flashes as bluish-white, red-tinged, and dusty red. Both the flashes and blast were reported from as far away as 70 miles. According to scientists from the Newfoundland University and the Canadian government, the event was caused by a meteorite or a bolt of lightning or an exploding fireball. Strangely enough, residents close to the area reported hearing a strong humming before the flashes and blast, while others stated that their television sets had gone black just before the event. That would make it a very strange meteor or fireball. Mrs. Bennett, one of the Bickfords' neighbors, probably expressed it best. She said it was like a bomb. UFO buffs interpreted the episode as a crash saucer. Many tied the whole thing in with the sonic booms plaguing the East Coast. Others blamed, not a crash saucer, but one which had actually landed. But these people weren't the only ones interested in the Bell Island Enigma. PACE, the Planetary Association for Clear Energy, had also been keeping track of the Soviet experiments. For the past few years, they've been investigating the high-energy signals which have been disrupting radio communications around the world. This unexplained interference has been in progress since July 1969. At times, it has blanketed the whole radio spectrum. PACE members believe that the Bell Island event was part of the same problem. According to Dr. Andrew Mikrowski, a member of the Canadian Secretary of State's think tank and co-founder of PACE, the explosion on Bell Island was the result of a standing columnar wave generated by powerful transmitters inside the Soviet Union. His group believes that a large iron ore deposit under Belle Island acted on the wave to bring about collapse and energy explosion. The collapse is thought to have resulted in the production of 3 spinning vortices of highly charged particles, which formed a plasma. When these vortices hit the ground, they released vast quantities of energy, which vaporized electrical systems and bored holes in the ground. Pace favors the Tesla magnifying transmitter as the source of these high-energy waves. They believe one or more of the transmitters are located in the northwest of the USSR. In fact, thanks to a link-up of monitoring stations in Canada using direction-finding equipment, they were able to pin down these 2 locations as the source of the interfering signal, blotting out radio bands. More importantly, Pace believes it has proof that there's more to these Soviet signals than complete interference. Working in cooperation with the Pacific Northwest Center in Portland, Oregon, a mass of evidence has been collected by the 2 groups. This data shows that the Soviet high-energy waves also contain pulse rates known to be biologically significant and useful in brainwave conditioning and programming in humans. By July 13, 1977, these 2 investigative groups determined that the signals were being directed at a specific target population in the US and Canada. Observers were able to track changes in the movement of the electromagnetic fields. These movements could be fast or slow, and the direction appeared to be from northeast to southwest. Oddly enough, many UFO researchers around the Great Lakes have noted the great number of times UFOs have been reported traveling from northeast to southwest. Reports show that on March 15, 1977, between 3 p.m. and 10 p.m., the interfering waves blotted out the signals of a 17,500 watt television station in Timmins, Ontario. Witnesses there observed a dielectric avalanche of the atmosphere, along with sheet lightning, which occurred regularly along the 30-mile-wide circumference of a field in counterclockwise direction. The color was reported as blue or a flashing fluorescence of high intensity. In another report from Ottawa, Canada's capital, on September 15, 1978, the same phenomenon was observed, which retained the same dimensions and coloring. When a random check was made of people living in the path of the perimeter of the wave, many complained of headaches and irritability. According to PACE members, it has been proven in scientific experiments that these type of pulses targeted at North America are capable of a variety of effects on humans. Among these are the inducement of trance states and out-of-body experiences. The possibilities posed by such transmission become more frightening when it's remembered that many aircraft in these areas are totally dependent on ground-based electronic guidance systems. Interference with signals in this system is dangerous, to say the least, for coupled with mind-altering pulses, it can lower the consciousness of pilots or other aircrew and result in disaster. This part of the problem has been considered serious enough that the US Air Force has begun studies of the effects of electromagnetic waves at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. John Keel explored some of the little-known aspects of low-frequency waves. He discovered that the transmitted waves were able to cancel out the signals on phone lines and the pulses in ignition coils. A recent similarity here is the case in September 1976, when the Iranian Air Force went into battle against 2 glowing UFOs. This was around the same time when the Soviets were making their first tests of their killer satellites using the high-energy particle beams. The Iranian pilots reported that the electrically controlled systems on board their jets had ceased to function. When they escaped the area, the so-called UFOs, their systems returned to normal, but in the meantime, the UFOs made their escape. Incidentally, it should be noted that the battle in the sky over Iran took place less than 500 miles from the Soviet Union's underground test facility. If this suggests that the Iranians are living in a dangerous neighborhood, the following will do nothing to brighten the picture. For, on September 19, 1978, Professor Heinz Kaminsky, director of West Germany's Bochum Observatory, blamed a Soviet underground blast for triggering the Iranian earthquake of September 16, 1978. Around 18,000 people were killed. That blast, Kaminsky said, registered 6.9 on the Richter scale and was recorded at seismological stations around the world, and it occurred 36 hours before the quake hit Iran. According to Kaminsky, the blast triggered geological fault lines in the Earth in the hours before the quake. Was the blast powerful enough to reach Iran? All of this is not intended to bunch UFOs into a bag marked Made in the USSR. Flying saucers are one thing, Soviet plasmoids are another, and it behoves the UFO researcher to separate the two. We're now left to wonder, what was the Soviet Union really doing? And could it have been a threat to the very existence of mankind? It's believed that all or maybe most living beings on our planet are well known and studied in detail by biologists, but this is not the case. Scientists are studying only one form of life on our planet, the protein life, but there is another life which is a cluster of the physical field. You look up at the sky on a clear day and it seems that it's absolutely clear, but it lives its own life invisible to people. It's literally teeming with strange objects, visible only in the bright rays of the sun. The whole sky is filled with them. Interestingly, objects are said to move only in one direction, bottom to top, with different angles at different speeds. The sizes of the objects are also different, but the speed of movement is very fast. The flight path of objects, as well as the speed with which they move, makes it possible to exclude the possibility that these are plant seeds or insects, according to some Russian researchers who were trying to film them not that long ago. Millions of strange objects are not visible to the human eye. Even a video camera is only able to see them if they are illuminated by the rays of the sun. What are they? Perhaps these are so-called plasmoids. Plasmoids, an energetic form of life that exists on Earth in parallel with the human civilization. This is a plasma system structured by its own magnetic field. Plasma is hot ionized gas. An example of this is ordinary fire. Plasma has the ability to dynamically interact with the magnetic field to keep the field in itself, and the field in turn orders the chaotic motion of charged plasma particles. Under certain conditions, a stable but dynamic system consisting of a plasma and a magnetified field can form. There is a hypothesis that plasmoids are one of the life forms that have existed on our planet for billions of years. In Western Europe, legends have been circulating since ancient times about fires that paralyzed the consciousness of a person and taken them away with it. Some researchers believe that the glowing spheres may have an alien origin. Human beings have encountered this life since their appearance on Earth, but we still know very little about them. If human beings can be called a ruler of the surface of the Earth, then according to some Russian researchers, this non-protein life can rightly be called the rulers of the planet's bowels and the sky above. The creatures that inhabit the Earth's firmament and sometimes break out of it into the sky possess varying names, but they have the same essence. In ancient times, they were considered the embodiment of the element of fire. Fire elementals, most often in historical chronicles with these elements of fire, appear as fire spheres. There was a Roman historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, and he described the appearance of the fire elementals in the year 362 AD or Common Era. Fireballs descended from the sky and burned all the workers who were trying to restore the temple in Jerusalem. Ammianus Marcellinus was born around 330 to 400 AD or Common Era. He was one of the last of the great Latin pagans historians of antiquity. He spoke about Jews in 4 separate passages of the history. The first one refers to Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem. In the second, he quotes the disparaging remarks of Marcus Aurelius regarding the Jewish people. But most importantly is the third passage, which contains a description of the attempt of Julian the Apostate to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He ascribes that this is not due to sympathy with the Jews, but because of the emperor's desire to leave a memorial to his reign. According to Marcelionis, the project was entrusted to a certain Alypius of Antioch, but it couldn't be executed because of an explosion of balls of fire on the Temple Mount. Julian the Apostate, Flavius Claudius Julianus, lived in the Common Era. He was a Roman emperor, and the story is extremely interesting, but in the 20th century descriptions of elementals took on a much more mundane appearance. But also, more specific, they were even captured on video camera. For example, on September the 12th at 9 o'clock in the evening, near the Russian village of Basia, Udoli, the car of Dmitry Regan, a paranormal researcher, got stuck in the mud. The researcher himself described his encounter with a fiery creature. The fireballs sometimes moved slightly away behind low clouds and hung against the background of an almost black sky. It was about a third of the size of the moon's disk, but it didn't change shape, its size to the optics of the TV camera. You could see its loose structure like cells of different shapes and sizes. I calmly filmed it for about 20 minutes. Fireballs floating in the air are common on Earth, but not ubiquitous. They definitely love some areas, and in those areas, the fireballs sometimes arrange real parades. Shigli became one of such zones favored by these fiery objects. The Shigli Mountains, or simply Shigli, are a range of wooded mountains located in Russia on the right bank of the Volga River inside the Samara Band. The Shigli are considered the only tectonically active mountains in eastern Russia. That's important. First having formed around 7 million years ago, the summits and other exposed areas of the Shigli are composed of limestone and dolomite sediments laid down 230 to 350 million years ago in the Permian and Carboniferous regions. For several years in a row, Samara, that's a city in Russia, a group of local historians came here to collect stories of local residents about their encounters with fiery entities. Local historians were lucky on one of the summer nights that they actually saw a real air parade over Shigli. Here's what one of the participants of the expedition wrote in his diary on August the 15th, 1990. At about 22 hours, I, as well as several of my comrades, observed a group of fireballs flying over the Shigli. Ahead of the group flew a large single ball with a small tail, followed by 9 smaller balls of spheres. They flew in a row of 3, shimmering with bright and long tails. Many of them believe that the fire elementals do not exist, and poetic stories about meeting with strange fiery objects that behave like living beings or are inspired by ancient myths and fairy tales, or just eyewitnesses of such meetings for the first time saw very ordinary ball lightning. Here's how the Canadian professor Michael Persinger explains the appearance of fire objects, balls and pillars. In the course of natural processes from a scientific point of view, these are fire objects that frighten people. They're born underground. Even very weak tectonic movements lead to mechanical stresses in siliceous rocks. Electricity is generated, which given their huge mass can reach a significant value. Under its influence, a column of ionized air over the section of rocks can twist around the axis. As a result, it creates ball lightning bolts that have sizes from a few centimeters to 1 to 2 meters. Maybe what witnesses had seen over the tectonically active Shigli was that, but you see, not all the appearances of fireballs can be explained by natural causes. Russian researchers of the unknown who followed the mission Kazanchev have long been talking about the possibility of the existence of beings on our planet. The basis of life for these beings are energy fields. It's likely that the energy life forms were able to reach a high level of their development and are not predatory jellyfish floating in the oceans of air, but actually intelligent beings. In some Eastern mystical manuscripts that have come down to our time, for example, in a ball of fire, it's said that the existence on Earth of intelligent races that do not have a solid body, but are fire clusters. Russian researchers say that we must accept the idea that on Earth we don't know protein nucleic life well enough as energy beings can exist next to it. Moreover, encounters with them can end in tragedy. True, they can exist only in energetically active areas of the planet, in conditions of constant energy supply, primarily in places where powerful electromagnetic currents reach the Earth's surface. for example in the magnetic poles of the planet. Yuri Gagarin, a member of the Soviet expedition to the South Pole, recalled his meeting with such creatures. Gagarin lived in Leningrad. Shortly before his death, he told a journalist a story that he had kept secret for a long time. There's no wonder, because for such things in the USSR they were forbidden. If you did, you were put in a mental asylum. In 1959, the Soviet expedition that established the Mir station in Antarctica sent a group of 6 explorers deep into the continent to reach the South Magnetic Pole. Only 2 of them returned. In the end, Gagarin recalled, they decided to tell the truth about what had happened. To his surprise, they believed them, but there was no convincing evidence. So what happened in 1959? The Soviet expedition for 3 weeks reached the South Magnetic Pole, and everything was going too well, Gagarin recalled. Troubles began for the expedition the next morning. 300 meters away from the all-terrain vehicle, a glowing ball jumped out of nowhere. The photographer of the expedition, Alexander Garadetsky, went forward with a camera in his hand. A glowing halo appeared around Garadetsky, and he screamed horribly. 2 shots rang out, and the group's senior officer, Andrei Kobylev, and the expedition's doctor, Rauman Kustov, were the ones who fired at the glowing ribbon. It swelled, sparks flew in all directions, and it disappeared with an explosion. Garadetsky lay dead. The back of his head, hands and back were charred. The glowing orbs reappeared on the path 2 days later. They appeared suddenly at an altitude of about 100 meters, then slowly descended, approaching the team. Kustov and Borissa started firing their rifles, and when Gagarin recovered from the shock, the balloon orbs were gone, and there was a smell of ozone in the air, as if after a severe thunderstorm. Kustov and Borissa lay dead in the snow, and the commander of the detachment, Andrei Kobylev, stood with his hands pressed to his eyes. He couldn't remember anything and didn't see anything, and sadly died on his return to the Mir station.
When you really think about it, the idea of disclosure has been with the UFO field since the very beginning, since we've known about flying saucers in the 1940s. And the question really is, will we ever have a moment in our world where this subject of UFOs is openly acknowledged by all elements of our society, including scientific establishments and political institutions? During the Second World War, 1945, when the first atomic bomb is detonated in history. We've never done this before. Are these beings interested in us because they see that we have unlocked this incredible secret, this major universal secret, that of the atom and nuclear technology? Why do the governments of the world feel the need to hide these objects that have been observed to travel at speeds that we don't really understand, how they can move the way they do, stop on a dime, take off instantly? Why the secrecy? These are the great unanswered questions of the UFO phenomenon. Someone, something is in control of them.
In recent years, there has been an increasing fascination with the idea of phantom cosmonauts lost in space, never to return to Earth. Supposedly, these brave space explorers were never acknowledged by the Soviet Union. Most were said to have died in space, but one was allegedly the first man in orbit and actually survived the ordeal. What is the truth of these stories of these phantom cosmonauts, and where does the idea of these mysterious lost space explorers originate? On April the 12th, 1961, the Soviets were proud to announce that they had finally managed to send the first man into space. 27-year-old cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had been put into orbit, becoming the first man to circle the Earth in a spacecraft, the Vostok 1. That time, Vostok 1 completed one almost circular orbit at a maximum altitude of 203 miles, before slowing down to the point that the capsule was pulled back into the atmosphere for ballistic re-entry. Gagarin became a media sensation because of this achievement, making headlines all over the world. However, there have long been rumours that there were other cosmonauts up there before this, and that their missions were top secret and their fate unknown, vanishing into the darkness of conspiracies and cover-ups. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was extremely intense. Both sides built and tested rockets as rapidly as possible, trying to be the first to launch an artificial satellite into orbit, often with disastrous results. Both sides had their successes, and both had their failures. People around the world watched and others listened. Some, most notably amateur radio operators, listened more closely than others, and of these, a pair of young brothers from Italy, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordia, were the most prominent. Their incredible library of audio recordings of almost every flight from the space race is by far the most comprehensive private collection ever created. But perhaps the main reason that the collection is so well known is that it includes a number of recordings of alleged events that have not made it into the history books. Doomed Soviet cosmonauts out in space, captured in their final moments of life, on flights that the Soviets claimed had never happened. The audio recordings of the Giudica Cordia brothers is the main evidence to support the conspiracy theory that the Soviet space program covered up a number of cosmonaut deaths in the 1960s. The brothers, who were located outside Turin in northern Italy, claimed to have intercepted several audio recordings of secret Soviet space missions that ended in tragedy and mystery. Achille and Giovanni were creative and scientific geniuses, were both in their 20s when the Soviets announced the successful launch of Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957. The brothers subsequently published the radio frequency for everyone to hear. After that, their completely self-taught education proceeded rapidly. Their incredible skills enabled them, when the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 only a month after Sputnik 1, to discover something new, a heartbeat. This was the heartbeat of Laika, a small dog sent on a one-way trip into space on Sputnik 2. There was no provision for re-entry or attempted recovery. 3 months later, the US launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, and the brothers again published the frequency of the signal. After this success, Achille and Giovanni became local media celebrities and were thus able to expand their operations into a nearby disused bunker left over from World War II, make improvements to their equipment and construct large antennas. They called their miniature radio observatory Torre Bert. On November 28, 1960, a West German observatory announced that it was receiving a strange signal on a Soviet space frequency. The brothers eagerly tuned in and heard hand-keyed Morse code repeating the international distress signal SOS over and over again. Their calculations showed that the distressed spacecraft was on a course directly away from the Earth. The signal then grew weaker and disappeared. It was never heard from again. Apparently the brothers had just recorded evidence that a manned Soviet spacecraft had somehow gone off course and left Earth's orbit permanently. Throughout the rest of the 1960s, the brothers recorded a number of radio communications from apparently secret Soviet Union space missions. In November 1963, the brothers recorded what they claimed was the voice of a female cosmonaut re-entering the Earth's atmosphere in a malfunctioning spacecraft. In the recording, she is heard to have cried out, "I am hot," meaning burning up. In total, the Giudica Cordia brothers released 9 audio recordings of Soviet space missions over a period of 4 years. There were precursors to such phantom cosmonaut stories. One such tale occurred in early 1958. There were rumours from the Soviet Union that a manned suborbital flight had hit a peak altitude of 186 miles. Adding to the believability of the story was a comment apparently from Austrian rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth, by then living in the US, mentioning a pilot killed on a suborbital flight. The flight, if it was real, definitely wasn't a space shot. Perhaps it was a high-altitude aircraft flight. Either way, the seed for the idea of secret Soviet launches had been planted. In the end, the story turned out to be fake and part of a radio broadcast, tricking listeners much like the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast of Orson Welles. More so-called phantom launches were to follow. On April the 9th, the day before Gagarin's first scheduled launch attempt, the British communist newspaper The Daily Worker reported that Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Sergeyevich Ilyushin was launched into orbit on April the 7th or 8th and circled the Earth no less than 3 times in his spaceship Russia before landing back on Earth safely. The article explained that some technical mishap had left Ilyushin deranged. He was thus hidden away from the public and his accomplishments swept under the carpet because he was now unfit for public appearances. This was not true. There was a real Ilyushin, but he was a pilot who had never joined the Soviet space program. The problem with obtaining any information about these lost cosmonaut stories is that during the Cold War, the details of the Soviet Union's space program were kept completely secret. The true progress of their space program was closely guarded, and only the best news would be released to the world. With their state-controlled media, the Soviets had the ability to organize cover-ups of failures to a degree that would never have been possible almost anywhere else. The identities of their rocket and spacecraft engineers were never revealed until well after they died. Pilots training for spaceflight were required to keep this fact secret until after they had actually been launched into space. Even then, details were sparse and often misleading. The vast, complicated project organised to attempt to land a Russian man on the moon was kept completely secret until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Consequently, in the absence of direct evidence relating to Soviet space travel, the Western media naturally had to rely on rumours and speculation, and perhaps on occasion their own inventiveness. Furthermore, observers inside the USSR and elsewhere frequently misinterpreted reports from Soviet news agencies, like one that listed cosmonauts that may or may not be living. All this meant that it was nearly impossible to work out exactly what the Soviet scientists were trying to do. Even if the objects of manned spaceflights were obviously not met, the state still claimed them to be completely successful, even when it was obvious that the planned objectives were not met. There were exceptions to this, however. Manned launches were announced only after they had achieved orbit, not after they had successfully landed. This meant that any deaths of cosmonauts in space had to be acknowledged and became the subject of national mourning. Aborted manned launches were also acknowledged, though with a considerable delay. The Soviets perhaps unwittingly helped nurture these rumours of cosmonaut deaths through imperfect censorship. Since the identities of certain cosmonauts were secret, they would be painted out of group photos of cosmonauts. Several versions of the same photo may appear, with or without these phantoms. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the curtain of secrecy was partially lifted. Many of the diaries and memoirs of Soviet managers, cosmonauts and engineers involved in the space program were published. A number of personal and official documents, diaries and contemporary notes from the era were sold at auction and purchased by Western museums and institutes. The Soviet Union's greatest secrets, the failed moon landing program, the Netherlands disaster, failed robotic launches, and many others were revealed to the world for the first time. The reports did indeed identify several cosmonauts who had died in training accidents, but there was no information at all regarding phantom cosmonaut stories in any of this new data. In fact, none of the stories of alleged lost cosmonauts have so far proved to be true. The Soviets celebrating Gagarin after his flight into space should leave little doubt that he was the first to orbit the Earth. In the end, it was Soviet news managers who were partly responsible for spreading stories of lost cosmonauts with ambiguous, boastful, and often twisted presentations of fact that created the mysterious and secretive atmosphere. But what of the recordings of the Judica-Cordeia brothers? Their recordings exist, and they are not hoaxes. But could they have misinterpreted what they heard? This is definitely a possibility. One compelling reason to be skeptical of their interpretation of their recordings is the lack of corroborating evidence from the many far more sophisticated radio tracking stations that existed at the time, with far better equipment than the brothers' home-built radio setup. Surely they would have picked up at least some of these lost cosmonaut broadcasts.
The Primorsky Krai region occupies the southeastern extremity of Russia. Primorsky means maritime in Russian, therefore the region is sometimes referred to as Maritime Province. Primorsky Krai is bordered by China, North Korea and the Sea of Japan. The picturesque town of Dalnegorsk, a former mining settlement, is located in the Primorsky Krai, in a narrow valley by the Rudnaya River, surrounded on all sides by forests and hills. These hills are also riddled with a number of deep caves. International fame came to Dalnegorsk in 1986, on January the 29th at 7:55 p.m. to be precise. Some have called the events that occurred there on that winter's night the Roswell incident of the Soviet Union. That cold January day, an orange-reddish sphere flew over the town from the southeast, crossed part of Dalnegorsk, and crashed at the Izvest-Koyava Lime Mountain, also known as Height 611 or Hill 611 because of its size. The object flew noiselessly and parallel to the ground. Its shape was described as being near perfectly round, with no projections, wings or windows, and its color was similar to that of burnished stainless steel. Some local witnesses at the time assumed it was a meteorite, while others thought it was something quite out of the ordinary. One eyewitness, Yevgeny Serebrov, a schoolboy at the time, nowadays he's a scientist, mentioned that the object had neither tail nor trail behind it. There was no explosion, only a powerful impact when it hit the mountain. Scientists who arrived later in Dalnegorsk from Vladivostok and Khabarovsk used a chronometer to determine that the object moved at 15 meters per second. They told Yevgeny and other boys that meteorites and fragments of rockets cannot fly in such a fashion. V. Korodko, editor of the local newspaper Trudoive Slovo, was near the mountain during the crash of this mysterious object. He stated that a small fire broke out at the impact site, but that it burned for only a short while. He went on to describe the event as follows. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that fell on the mountain. There was an indistinct impact, not reverberating, but quite strong. The noise of the impact lasted less than a second. There was an explosion and large reddish-white flames. It seemed something was engulfed in a powerful fire. The sphere was approximately 1 meter in diameter. The fire roared. I observed all of it for about 5 minutes. The fire burned for 1 to 2 minutes, then stopped. Height 611 is located across from a local bus station. V. Kondakov, a local mechanic, was at the bus station at the moment the sphere flew over the town. He said the sphere was flying so low that it seemed it would cut off part of the chimney of the nearby industrial factory. It was round without any protrusions or holes. It seemingly was made from metal, and its color resembled slightly incandescent stainless steel. Kondakov thought the sphere a shell, a projectile. He didn't hear any noises. Kondakov observed how the object crashed down on the hill, but heard no sounds of the impact. The ground at the site of the impact began to burn. According to Mikhail Gerstein, Russia's top UFO researcher and author of numerous books about ufology and paranormal phenomena, many eyewitnesses compared the fire burning at the site to electrical welding. The extent of the fire was alternatively described as 1 to 2 minutes, about an hour, or even late into the night. On February 2, 1986, a parent of one of the children that observed the crash, accompanied by an adult and some school children, made an excursion to the site. They found a burned tree stump, a hollow that was not deep, and branches that seemed to have been cut off the tree by the object as it descended. There were no large fragments of material like that of an airplane crash. They collected, very methodically, melted drops of some substance that had a metallic tint, rocks and a piece of tree stump. They took everything to the local Museum of Regional Studies. The drops resembled soft metal. Several various acids were used on them, but there was no reaction. Then they decided to obtain further scientific opinion from V. Berlizov, a local expert and a member of the 1947 scientific expedition to the site of the Sincote-Alin meteorite. They wanted an expert opinion on what this material could be. There was no quick reply from the experts, and so the director decided to use other means at his disposal. His group was able to climb the mountain 3 days after the crash. The UFO, he told Soviet journalists, broke off a terrace of rock about 2 cubic meters, and 10 square meters of snow had evaporated at the site. The vegetation had been burnt away, and the ground seemed to have been burnt as well. The newspaper revealed that the team found magnetized fragments of silicate shale. Can you imagine a brick that attracts metal? High temperatures, anomagnetism, but in this case it was quite the contrary. This, mentioned Dushilny, once more confirmed that it was not a ball lightning or a plasmoid that arrived in height 611, but a UFO. The team was amazed that the area burned by fire was strictly defined, as if separated. A rhododendron bush growing at the very edge of the area, burned to ashes, remained absolutely untouched by fire. But the rock, composed of light brown silica shale, cracked and fissures were formed, and it turned black as cold. A thin layer of soil was mixed with ashes. Careful examination of the site turned up some 30 grams of an unusual substance. It consisted of solidified droplets of dark colors. Most droplets were tiny, from 0.5 millimeter to 2 millimeters in diameter, and some were larger, from 3 to 5 millimeters. They contacted the laboratory at the nearby industrial enterprises. The analysis performed there revealed that smaller droplets consisted of an incredible alloy of lead, and it contained up to 17 elements of the Mendeleev table. Large-sized droplets turned out to be compounds of chromium, nickel, and aluminium. Only a diamond saw blade was able to cut through them. Another incongruity was revealed. The alloy of metal had to have crystalline structure, but was actually amorphous, like soap. Such amorphous metals can be produced in laboratory settings using liquid helium to cool melted, extremely hot metal. But the crash took place on a naked, rocky mountainside. The objects collected at the site were later dubbed as tiny nets or mesh or little balls, lead balls and glass pieces. This is what each resembled. Closer examination revealed very unusual properties. On one of the tiny nets, it contained torn and very thin 17 micrometer threads. Each of the threads consisted of even thinner fibers tied up in plaits. Intertwined with the fibers were very thin gold wires. The study of the droplets determined that the distance between atoms in the crystalline array of metal balls was 3.84 angstroms, not the usual 3.86 angstroms, as is usual in metal. Most of all these specialists were amazed by items which were dubbed net or mesh. They were composed of amorphous carbon. The rare earth atoms there were distanced from each other. Scientists calculated 18 elements in the net. The gold content of the net was equivalent to 1,100 grams per ton. Only 4 grams per ton are needed for industrial exploitation of ore deposit, and silver content was equivalent to 3,100 grams per ton. Using electronic microscopes, scientists discovered that the surface of the net contained quartz threads of 70 microns in thickness. The threads intertwined and tied together into a precise cord. One of the threads revealed a sort of golden section, an extremely thin gold line somehow placed in the very middle of the net. Later, gold lines were discovered in other specimens. When scientists tried to straighten one of the loops to be able to see it better, the loop disappeared, jumped from view, and they couldn't find it. Other elements were as jumpy. Alexei Kulikov, Doctor of Geological Mineralogical Sciences at the Institute of Organic and General Chemistry of the Far Eastern branch of Russian Academy of Sciences, researched the metal balls. He said that speaking about the net, it wasn't possible to understand what it actually was. It resembled glassy carbon, but it was not known how it had been created. Most likely, super high temperatures can produce conditions to permit creation of such glassy carbon. The tree stump from height 611 was no less amazing. Burned wood is pure carbon, wood coal. One side of the tree stump was dull, the other side was shiny, as if covered by a lacquer. After some time, the scientists realized that it was melted carbon. Carbon melts at 3,000 degrees Celsius. Specialists in the field of physics of metals, as well as other scientists, stated that it would be impossible to imagine that any branch of industry would use simultaneously such a combination of the Mendeleev periodic table for any purpose. Having examined 15 local mineral specimens, Russian ufologists discovered fresh signs of polishing by hard, solid metal. The polishing was glassy from 0.5 to 4 or 5 millimeters. It was done by a hard body or flying at the speed of a bullet metal balls. Mussolini received a report from the Izmiran Institute of Earth Magnetism, Ionosphere and Radio Waves Propagation, the Leningrad branch. This institute was involved in the secret Soviet UFO research programs from 1978 to 1991, Setka-An. They conducted analysis of lead balls from height 611. The conclusions arrived by scientists where the balls were made on Earth, but the lead was not from Dalnegorsk deposit, but from another deposit in the North Baikal region. He was certain that the alien probe that crashed on height 611 was capable of using metals from Earth deposits for its repair needs. In the summer of 1986, at one of the military airports located in the area, guards were alerted by reports about noise made by jet aircraft engines. It was as if someone started them. 4 times in a row, the guards checked around the airport. Nothing suspicious was detected, although the noise increased and then subsided. Upon their return to the guard post, the officers observed the vertical ascent of silvery disk from the airfield. It imitated the sound of a jet aircraft. A Russian expert on aircraft crashes, a distinguished journalist and author of books on paranormal phenomena, stated that these objects were manufactured in the USSR and the technology necessary to produce such objects dates back to 1970s, and that he has ultra-thin filaments that came from these objects in his possession. The following information is taken from UFO researcher Roberto Pinotti's book UFO Contacts in Italy, Volume 2, which has been published by Philip Mantle's publishing company, Flying Disc Press. It's the first time this information has been made available in English. In 2000, during the annual World UFO Symposium in San Marino, a colleague, Alfredo Licini, gave a lecture on the sensational discovery of some new original material which was sent to them anonymously on a number of occasions regarding the existence of the so-called fascist UFO files. This material dealt with a purported flying saucer that had either crashed or landed near Magenta in Lombardy in Italy on April the 11th, 1933, some 14 years before the famous Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash. This event involved a subsequent investigation by an obscure war intelligence unit called Gabinetto RS-33 or RS-33 Cabinet. RS is the acronym for Ricerche Speciali, or Special Researches. The 33 means 1933. This group had been authorized by Benito Mussolini to study the problem. Later, the crash UFO was stored in the hangars of the SIAI Marchetti in Vergiate. Mussolini thought that this unconventional flying vehicle was a French, British or German secret weapon. But apparently Guglielmo Marconi believed it was extraterrestrial in nature. The RS-33 Cabinet, according to the mysterious sender of the material, who wrote saying he was a relative of one of its members who had investigated this. Apparently between 1933 and 1940, there were many different Italian UFO sightings. In one instance, an Italian fighter plane intercepted a UFO between Ravenna and Rome, and in August 1936, there was a multiple UFO sighting, a flying cigar, and two Saturn-shaped UFOs over Mestre and Venice. According to the fascist UFO files that were received, it was founded by Mussolini along with fascist members Italo Balbo and Galeazzo Ciano, and was headed by Guglielmo Marconi. The first UFO case was in 1931 near Venice. The second is the above-mentioned case when on June 13, 1933, a landed UFO was recovered. The three telegrams, there are four actually concerning the recovery of the UFO, and a protocol was sent to the prefect, intended for the Italian Secret Service and the newspapers in order to cover up this news. It all began in early 1996 when Roberto received a handful of handwritten notes on stationery bearing the seal of the Kingdom's Senate in the mail. The year mentioned in the material was 1936, and in the handwritten document, first sent to a certain Vanibeghi by a secret agent using the name Andrea, there was a sketch of a mysterious airship. He writes, "It was observed in the morning. It was a metallic disc, polished and reflecting light, with a length of 10 or 12 meters. Two fighter aircraft from a nearby Air Force base took off, but were not able to reach it, even traveling at 130 kilometers per hour. It didn't emit any sound, which would lead one to consider an aerostat or balloon. But nobody knows of balloons that can fly faster than the wind." He said he knew for sure that it was seen by other pilots. The report arrived in the hands of Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, and Italy's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Then, after approximately an hour, and after flying over Mestre, it was seen as a sort of a metallic tube, grey or slate in colour. A drawing by a confidential informant was redrawn by Andrea, who, as far as the two A and B drawings are concerned, explained that A was described as being like a kind of aerial torpedo with very clear windows and with alternating white and red lights. B were two hats like those used by priests. They were wide, round, with the dome in the center, metallic, and followed the torpedo without changing their relative positions. Although Andrea's report is only one of several received by Lissoni and Roberto since 1996, its contents are sensational, since it describes a classic flying saucer. In 1936, with aircraft alerted and multiple witnesses. It also reveals that Mussolini and Ciano, Italy's number 1 and 2 leaders at the time, were kept informed of the situation. At first, as the recipient of the material for Centro Ufologico Nazionale, Roberto decided to file it away for the time being until a deeper analysis or fresh evidence was available that might be able to establish its authenticity. A long time passed and the search for eyewitnesses was fruitless. The document had indicated 3 names, all of whom were now untraceable. Then finally, CUN member Dr. Cristina Vanucci managed to secure the testimony of an aging relative, Faustino, who unfortunately died shortly afterwards, who confirmed that he had been present and had seen the incredible thing flying over Mestre and Venice. Indeed, other caches of documents sent by the anonymous Mr. X, as we decided to call him, and were received by CUN before the daily newspaper Il Resto del Carlino of Bologna, whose skeptical journalists did not publish them, and by the contactee-orientated magazine UFO La Visita Extra-Terrestrials, mentioned in Cabinet RS-33. This magazine was charged with both investigating and covering up what the documents call Vel I Voli Non Convenziali, or VNC is an acronym for Unconventional Flying Vehicles. Unfortunately, an original 30-page dossier about VNC, i.e. the one that had been sent to the newspaper Il Resto del Carlino of Bologna, was lost, while the first batch of photocopied material was sent to UFO La Visita Extra-Terrestrials did not have the result Mr. X had desired. The magazine entrusted their inquiry to the Naples ufologist Uberto Tallarico, who was skeptic about the case. The material got published, but they considered it a fake. Evidently, greatly disappointed and weary, On September the 10th, 1999, Mr. X sent a letter of protest anonymously, repeating what we've just said about the RS-33 cabinet and supplying the names of some of its members. A certain shadowy Dr. Ruggero Constanti Cavazzini, and also Professor Severi, Professor Bottazzi, Professor Giordano, and Professor Crocco, all real people. Enclosed also was a newspaper clipping about a French Air Force pilot who had vanished in Italy. A pilot who, as we discovered later, had the misfortune to film a UFO and then spoke to the Italians about it. Cabinet RS-33 had links with the fascist secret police OVRA and with Agenzia Stefani, the regime's news agency in charge of disseminating fascist information and propaganda. As far as the 1933 case, the fascist UFO files include a priority and most confidential telegram from the telegraph office in Milan. The sender was Agenzia Stefani, Milano, explaining that, by personal order of the Duce, i.e. Mussolini, absolute silence is required about an alleged landing on national soil of an unknown aircraft. Stop. Released version dispatched today by Stefani Agency confirmed. Stop. The same version also applies to personnel and journalists. Stop. Anticipated max punishment for transgressors up to the referral to the Tribunal for State Security. Stop. Although it has not been possible 70 years later to find eyewitnesses to those events who were still living, it's thought that they did find an indirect confirmation of the landing, or maybe of the crash of the flying saucer, in a news item in the popular weekly magazine Domenica del Corriere on July the 9th, 1937. The news item described an enormous and brilliant flash of lightning, which one night injured 5 pedestrians on the road between Magenta and Novara. As the president of the Royal Italian Academy of Sciences, Senator Guglielmo Marconi, Italy's Nobel Prize winner and famous scientist and inventor, was the director of the panel, which also included several other eminent Italian astronomers, scientists and aeronautical engineers. The late Dr. Antonio Caravaglia, a top Italian forensic consultant, conducted tests on the material they received, and the results were positive, authenticating the most important papers of the drawing of the 1936 UFO reported over Mestre. Copies of 18 secret documents from the fascist era, handwritten notes and telegrams, as well as a forensic report authenticating one of the papers with a drawing of 2 Saturn-shaped flying saucers following their cylindrical mothership, were released by CUN to the Italian media, including the national TV network Rai Uno and leading newspapers such as Il Resto del Carlino, La Nazione and La Repubblica. As things went badly for Italy during the war, all the files from the RS-33 cabinet were supposedly shipped to Nazi Germany. As Lissoni points out, rumors of Nazi discs have plagued the UFO literature for decades, and one Italian scientist, Giuseppe Belluzzo, is always mentioned in conjunction with the Germans, Meade, Schriever, and Habermohl. Much nonsense has been written about the so-called German flying saucers, some of it unabashed propaganda, yet undoubtedly there is at least some truth to the matter. The names of Meath et al. Are confirmed by the FBI and other US and German documents. It's also possible that the German V-7, a revolutionary disc-shaped aircraft whose existence as a prototype was confirmed by Hermann Oberth, was initially developed after Italian research by VNC. The technician for Mussolini's Italian Social Republic in 1944 and 1945 in the Garda Lake area found and gave 17 original documents from their father, including detailed drawings of the outer parts of the design of an Italian-shaped discomet, showing an unknown and never-produced Italian discoidal aircraft he had designed in the last months of World War II. Besides, since the end of the 30s, a German aircraft designer named Nordung had been attempting to build a solar flying disc to be sent out into space, subsequently renamed the Flying Wheel. So it's no wonder that the Italian fascists, finding themselves confronted with a UFO, should have opted for the explanation that it was a secret weapon. Are the fascist UFO files authentic? Obviously, considering the technical forensic analysis conducted for CUN, the answer is positive for the writer and his colleague Alfredo Lissoni. who, in the archives of the prefecture in Milan, also found about 500 copies of telegrams of the prefects of the Kingdom of Italy to the government between 1933 and 1938, some of which concerned definite reports of unconventional flying vehicles, and showed the attention Italian authorities directed to the problem. So they appear genuine in spite of the fact that critics do not accept them as proper historical documents. But even if we consider them only as a sort of private correspondence, the fact that they mentioned the UFO phenomenon in a report dated 1936 cannot be ignored.